Hi, hello and welcome to Dr. Vinita's Bio classes. The aim of this channel is to develop an interest in students towards biology. We are continuing with our first chapter on sexual reproduction of flowering plants, and today's topic is pollination. So you have already studied that the male gametophyte is produced in the anther and the female gametophyte is produced in the ovary. But the problem is that none of these gametophytes are motile. They both are non-motile. If both the structures are non-motile, then how do they fertilize? The male and the female gamete has to come together for fertilization. But if both of them are non-motile, how do they come together? So here comes the next term, pollination. So pollination is a process or it is a mechanism of transfer of the male gametophyte in the pollen grains to the stigma of the pistil or carpel of a flower. But being non-motile, the pollination is being achieved by certain external agents. So certain external agents come into play for the process of pollination. And based on the source of the pollen grains, there are three types of pollinations. First one is the autogamy. Second one is called Geitonogamy. And third one is known as Xenogamy. So these are the three types of pollinations, and this is based on the source of the pollen grains. So what is autogamy? What is meant by auto? Auto means self. Okay, so the term autogamy is self-pollination or self-fertilization. This type of fertilization, that is autogamy, is achieved within the same plant. So how does this happen? We all know that many of the plants have both the male and the female gametes in the same flower. So in this type of fertilization, the pollen grain of the flower goes to the stigma of the same flower. So pollination happens within the same flower. This is called as autogamy or self-fertilization, that is fertilization of the male and the female gamete of the same plant. That is known as autogamy. There are some other factors also which seem to interfere here, right? Can you think of something else which can affect in the autogamy? Of course, there should be synchrony, right? Autogamy requires synchrony. Synchrony is something which happens together or simultaneously. So there should be synchrony between the pollen maturation and the receptivity of the stigma. The stigma is not receptive all the time. The pollen grains, once it is matured, it will be shed, right? And this has to be received by the stigma of the same flower, and so the stigma should also be in a stage wherein it can accept the pollen grains and help it in the generation of the pollen tube to reach to the ovary. So the synchronization is an important thing in autogamy. Other than that, the stigma and the anther, if it is in proximity, the chances of fertilization is more. So in the case of autogamy, there should be a synchrony and the anther and the stigma should be in proximity. Proximity means close together. So proximity is also needed. And generally, for a successful pollination to happen, the age of the ovule, pistil morphology, and the receptivity of the stigma, these three play a major role. The age of the ovule, the morphology of the pistil, and the stigma receptivity. These three play a major role in pollination to be successful. So the examples of the self-pollinating flowers include viola, and other plants include oxalis, commelina, etc. So that's about autogamy. Now, before going into the Geitonogamy and the Xenogamy, let me introduce two other terms to you. Based on the type of breeding, the plants have been divided into three breeding systems. They are, first is the Chasmogamous flowers. Second is Cleistogamous flowers. And third is a mixed breeding system, that is both Chasmogamous and Cleistogamous flowers. Mixed breeding system. So what is meant by Chasmogamous flowers? Chasmogamous flowers have both their anthers and the stigma exposed to the outer environment. So when they have the exposed anthers and stigma, what will be its peculiarity? When the anther and the stigma are exposed, then the chances of cross-fertilization is more, right? And what is meant by Cleistogamous flowers? Cleistogamous flowers undergo autogamy. We saw that autogamy is self-fertilization. That is, the pollen grains of a flower, it pollinates the stigma of the very same flower. That is, it is self-fertilization. So, Cleistogamous flowers, they are autogamous. They are not open for cross-pollination. They are self-pollinated. Okay. In such type of flowers, the anther and the stigma will be close together. It will be very much near. It will be in very proximity, so that the self-fertilization is successful. And here, there is no need of any agents or mediators for pollination. The advantage with the Cleistogamous flowers is that there are more chances of fertilization and seed formation, but there are certain disadvantages also. What could be the disadvantage? Here, cross-pollination doesn't happen. So the disadvantage here is that the genetic variation will be very less. The genetic variation will be very less in Cleistogamous flowers because cross-pollination doesn't happen. So there are chances of defective allele formation. What do you mean by allele? Allele is the gene which is mutated due to some genetic factors. Okay, so the chances of appearance of this alleles, defective alleles, is more in Cleistogamous flowers. Okay, and next is the third one is mixed breeding system. Here the plant will have both the Chasmogamous flowers as well as the Cleistogamous flowers. The Chasmogamous flowers, which has its anthers and stigma exposed to the environment, and they also have the Cleistogamous flowers which do not open to the external. Self-fertilization happens. So what is the advantage of such kind of a mixed breeding system? Obviously, the cross-fertilization happens, because of which the genetic variation will be very high, and due to the Cleistogamous flowers, the self-fertilization happens and the chances of seed formation is very high. So here the genetic variation also happens and the chances of seed formation is also very high, because most of the time cross-pollination is a factor of chance. So here the genetic diversity is assured and the seed formation is also assured under even the extreme conditions where the pollinators are not available. Also, the pollination happens. So these are the three types of breeding systems or the three types of flowers. Okay, now we'll again go into the Geitonogamy. In Geitonogamy, What is the term Geitonogamy? Geitonogamy means, Geitono means neighbor. Okay, so here it is neighbor fertilization. That is fertilization with the neighboring flower. Autogamy was self-fertilization. Geitonogamy is neighbor fertilization. In Geitonogamy, the pollen grains from the anther of a flower, it pollinates with the stigma of another flower which is in the same plant. So the plant will be the same, but the flowers will be different. Unlike the autogamy, where the plant and the flower was also the same, Geitonogamy is the pollination between the anther and the stigma of two different flowers in the same plant. So the plant is the very same, but the flowers will be different. And that is known as Geitonogamy, and that is the neighbor fertilization. It is fertilizing with the neighborhood. It is pollinating with the neighborhood flower. Okay, so that is about Geitonogamy. The pollination in Geitonogamy is cross-pollination, and it requires an agent which helps in the pollination. And next is the Xenogamy. What does the term Xeno mean? Xeno means alien or stranger or a foreigner. Okay, so it is a stranger or a foreigner or a alien. Okay, so Xenogamy happens in between two entirely different plants, two entirely different flowers of entirely different plants. So here the pollen grains from the anther of a flower is transferred to the stigma of another plant, and this is the only kind of cross-pollination which brings about genetic variability, because in Geitonogamy also we saw that there is cross-pollination, but the pollination is limited to the flowers in the same plant. So because the pollination is limited to the same plant, the genetic variability will be less. But the Xenogamy is the only cross-pollination wherein the genetic variability is too high. Now onto the next topic, agents of pollination. We know that pollination is a chance factor. There are very less chances that the pollination is successful and seed formation occurs. And for helping with the pollination, there are several agents of pollination, and they can be both abiotic and biotic. Abiotic means which doesn't have life, and biotic has life. Okay, so abiotic, which are the abiotic agents of pollination that you can remember? Yes, of course, it is the air or the wind and water. Okay, so wind and water, they are the abiotic agents of pollination, and the biotic agents of pollination can be any animal. Okay, so they are animals which are involved in pollination. So first we'll study about the abiotic agents of pollination. So wind and water, we said, are the abiotic agents of pollination, and wind is the most common agent of pollination. Most of the pollination happens through the wind, but for the pollination to happen through the wind, there are certain prerequisites. That is, the pollen grains should be lightweight and it should be non-sticky in nature. Only if it is non-sticky and lightweight, the pollen grains can move in the wind very easily so that it can reach its destination. And mostly, the wind-pollinated flowers will have a feathery nature of the stigma so that it can trap the pollen grains which come in the wind. And another feature of the wind-pollinated flowers is that it will be mostly an inflorescence, that is, it will be a cluster of flowers. And what could be the advantage of having an inflorescence? The inflorescence will have so many stigma in it, right? And these stigma can help in the trapping of the pollen grains which come through the wind. But the wind pollinated flowers will have only one ovule in the ovary. Okay, so the wind pollinated flowers, it should be lightweight, it should be non-sticky, the stigma will be feather-like, and it will have inflorescence, and the ovary will have only one ovule. So these are the characteristics of the wind pollinated flowers. Examples of wind pollinated flowers include most of the grasses. They are all wind pollinated, and the corn cob. The corn cob. You have seen the corn, right? And in the corn, you can see that there are some tassels which are flying all around in the wind on the cone, and that is actually the stigma and the style part of the cone. It is flying so that it can trap all the pollen grains which flies along the wind. The next agent of pollination coming under the abiotic agents is water. The pollination through water is very rare. Only some water plants do this pollination through water, and mostly it is the monocotyledons and the lower plants which do pollination through water. For example, the algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes, these are all classes of plants which do water pollination. Certain freshwater plants such as the Vallisneria and Hydrilla, they use the water as a medium for pollination. These are plants which do pollination through water, and they are the freshwater varieties. Okay, and Zostera is a marine variety which does pollination through water. In Vallisneria, the style of the flower, it reaches the top, and the pollen grains of the flowers, they are also released on the surface of water, and so from the surface they float and reach the stigma of the Vallisneria plant. In the case of Zostera, the female flowers will be under the water, and the pollen grains, which will be long and ribbon-like, that will be also released into the water, and it flows to find the stigma of the plant. So this is how water pollination happens. And the peculiarity of the pollen grains which are transported through water is that they will be mucilaginous in nature. They will be having a mucilaginous covering, so that it is protected from wetting. But all the water plants do not depend upon this fertilization through water itself. There are certain plants which depend upon pollination through winds. For example, the water lily or the water hyacinth, the flowers of these plants, they come above the water so that it is pollinated by the wind or by insects. Okay, so it's not mandatory that all the water plants, they are pollinated through water. Now moving on to the biotic agents. Here, animals are used as pollinating agents. Several animals act as pollinating agents. For example, the bees, butterflies, flies, ants, mosquitoes, and certain birds such as the hummingbird, sunbird, and certain mammals such as the bats, and certain large animals such as lemurs, rodents, and lizards. They all act as pollinators. The insect pollinated flowers, it will be large, it will be colorful, it will be highly fragrant, and it will also have nectar in it. So these are the factors which attracts the biotic agents, that is, the fragrance, the size, the color, and the presence of nectar. So these are the factors which help in the pollination by animals. In case the flowers are small, there will be inflorescence so that it can attract the insects. So these are the peculiarities of flowers which are animal pollinated. And certain flowers which are pollinated by the beetles and the flies, they have a very foul smell because that is for attracting the beetles and the flies. And out of all these pollinating agents, bees are the one which pollinate the most. They are the most common agents of pollination in biotic agents. We know that the bees are attracted to flowers and they collect the nectar from it, right? So nectar as well as the pollen grains, they are actually the rewards that these flowers give to the bees or the biotic agents of pollination. So it is with the help of these nectar. So this nectar or the pollen grains, it actually is a trap for the insects so that it is attracted to these flowers, and while they come in contact with this flower, the pollen grains, they get coated onto these animals and these animals bring about pollination. So this is how pollination happens with the biotic agents. There are several other mutualistic ways of pollination as well. That is, other than the rewards such as the nectar and the pollen grains, the flowers also provide a shelter for certain insects such as the Amorphophallus. Amorphophallus is the tallest flower. Its height is about 6 feet. And these flowers, they provide shelter to certain animals so that they can lay their eggs within this flower and thereby help in the pollination of the flower. And certain other plants also have this mutualistic way, that is, there is a plant called yucca, and this yucca plant and the life cycle of this yucca plant is in close association with a moth, and this moth deposits its egg in the locule or the ovarian cavity of the ovary, and pollination is also carried out, and the larvae of this moth comes out when the seed germinates. So that's a mutualistic way of existence of this moth and the plant yucca. So that's all about pollination and the agents of pollination. Thank you.